welcome to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Phil Beckman. On today's program, we'll talk about wildlife in Pennsylvania. But first, we're joined by Stephen Caruso, government reporter for Spotlight PA. Stephen, you write that Governor Josh Shapiro will begin publicly disclosing when he uses taxpayer-funded state police aircraft. Why?
Well, the why is it's basically because of a mix of questions that came from Spotlight PA and questions by Senate Republican lawmakers. Spotlight PA had gotten a tip that there was, something kind of happening with the governor's using a state police plane or planes, and then we were kind of waiting to see kind of how this story would develop. Asked some questions about a public right to know request, and then Senate Republicans also asked lawmakers about this as well. Asked the Spear administration. So that happened about 2 weeks ago during a budget hearing. And then the governor's administration said, a spokesperson said a few days later in response to questions from Spotlight that they would start revealing them. So we basically only know about this because of, a mix of questions coming from Spotlight and Senate Republicans.
What are some of the rules in terms of using either a PennDOT aircraft or a Pennsylvania State Police aircraft?
Well, so there are rules. So I should say, like PennDOT, as you noted, PennDOT has a plane. It's been used by governors in the last for decades, and that plane has some rules, like you can't commute with it, for instance. It should only be used when it is more effective than a commercial flight. There's a priority list of who gets access to the flight first. The governor is up there, and then it's the lieutenant governor, cabinet officials, legislative leaders at the bottom. And this plane has been used by Governor Shapiro frequently. He set new records for it in 2023, his first year, as he crisscrossed the state, holding press events, going to the opening of state parks. He had to deal with a budget impasse, and there's a few flights that are linked to that. Use kind of declined in 2024, but the state police plane, which Spotlight noted, it's not clear what the rules are for that. And I should say too, we know about state plane use from PennDOT because there's a law requiring disclosure of those flights that has been in place since the early 2010s. There's no such law with the state police. What the governor said is that he will be, keeping records and logs of the state police plane in the same fashion as PennDOT. But even then, that has some concerns from lawmakers who say that data isn't useful enough. But so either way, what we're going to see is just, I think I'm expecting to see more attention on this, particularly Senate Republicans who, brought it up in their budget hearings.
Talk more about the records and the logs. What type of information is included in them?
So what's included is basically a list of where the flight was going, who was on the flight time, cost, and then a purpose. But there's a lot of caveats. The data is by day, so you have every passenger who got the plane that day, but you don't necessarily have where they got on, where they got off. It would just, let's say, the governor as having flown it on, March 1st, and then the cost can be divided up by agency because technically, there's an invoicing system, so it's hard to tell exactly maybe they've started to divide it up, but sometimes it's just a blank cost. And then there's also there is a requirement for an official purpose to be listed, but in recent years, pretty much all that's listed is either business or maintenance. So we don't actually know where people are flying. Now, when I ask the governor questions, or sometimes you line it up, when you have the public calendar, you get a sense of, he's going to, Whitehaven because or he's going to Luzerne County because he's going to open a state park there that was on the public schedule. But other times he's going to DC for an unclear purpose, or he even went to Springfield, Illinois in 2023 to meet with Governor Pritzker, which wasn't on his public calendar at that time. So there is this requirement for information to be released. It isn't always helpful.
How did you use flight trackers in your investigation?
So yeah, as I mentioned, Spotlight kind of got a tip about this, but also what helped confirm our hunch was, and our tip was on the day that Luigi Mangione was captured, the alleged shooter of the United Healthcare CEO. The governor appeared at a last-minute press conference to tout the capture and talk about, sort of just the shooting writ large. And Spotlight PA has had a tracker on the plane, the state plane, as it's completely fine. Flight aware is something that exists. But we noticed that that state plane had flown that day, which was curious to us. And we just checked the Altoona airport, and lo and behold, there was a flight that was registered to APSP maintenance contractor, which was our first inkling of like what FOINA could be. And then since then we've been, that's just been added to the list of planes to take care of.
We've been speaking with Stephen Caruso, government reporter with Spotlight PA. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
More of the PCN Capitol Preview after this short break. Welcome back. We are joined by Stephen Smith, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Steve, thanks for being here.
Absolutely.
Let's start off talking about avian influenza. There are a lot of stories about that right now. What is the state of that in Pennsylvania?
Yeah, avian influenza is something that we started noticing in snow geese population specifically around the end of 2024. So late December, we started noticing where snow geese were having incidents of high die-offs happening, particularly in quarries in the southeastern part of the state. That presented numerous challenges, specifically because of the ability for the disease to potentially transmit to humans as well. So we had hundreds of sick and dying birds on the landscape, in quarries, and also an urgency to remove the birds, but to do so in a way that was safe and protecting of our employees and other staff that were out there. So it essentially created an all-hands-on-deck situation with the Game Commission, the Department of Ag. We involved the Department of Health, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to make sure that we were removing those birds as quickly as possible. Since then, fortunately, the incidents seem to be on a decline. However, there is a typical pattern that happened this year and has in the past as well, where after high-path avian influenza is found in a wild population, it seems to then appear in commercial populations as well. And that pattern has certainly played out over the past couple of weeks. Again, from the wild population perspective, we've seen cases start to decline. However, given the transmission of the disease, how quickly it can spread, as well as the continuing migration period, I don't believe anybody believes that this occurrence is completely over, and we are continuing the monitoring. And one thing that we're asking residents of the Commonwealth to do is anytime they see certainly a dead goose, sick, injured wildlife, to give us a call so we can go out, potentially remove that animal safely, and continue to surveil the spread of the disease.
What are some of the symptoms of an infected bird?
It's a neurological disease, so some of the symptoms are going to appear very quickly. You're going to see a bird that's unable to fly, stumbling around. That's probably one of the benefits of the disease, if I could say that, in that the symptoms appear very quickly, and it's very apparent that a bird is suffering from this disease.
So do you want people to contact the Game Commission if they see that type of bird too?
Absolutely, absolutely, especially in this area where we know it seems to be taking place, because we do put a high priority on trying to remove those birds then from that landscape as quickly as possible.
How does transmission take place?
As with any influenza, usually bird-to-bird contact is what spreads the disease, and given that these are migratory birds, they certainly flock together, as we know, the transmission can happen pretty quickly.
So is this something that is just naturally occurring within the wild population that isn't transmitted to, say, farm animals?
It seems to be. That seems to be the best theory, that it is something that, if you look at how it's been spreading across the states, it follows the migratory path for a lot of these birds. They are spreading it amongst themselves, and then there seems to be, again, that pattern seems to be where it shows up then in commercial flocks.
How does the Game Commission track? With the spread of this among wild animals?
We survey the population constantly. We rely on citizens letting us know where it's happening. We monitor it. We have a state veterinarian who plays a big role in following the disease transmission.
Does it affect other animals other than birds?
It seems to be that possibility. It seems to be happening. We've had potential cases where foxes have transmitted the disease, so we know that potential exists. And it also happened where a member of the public has transmitted or came in contact with the disease.
What role does the federal government play in your efforts to mitigate this?
Yeah, they play a big role as helping us monitoring it, as well as they were a partner when it came time to remove some of the birds off the landscape and remove the sick and injured birds.
Now, there's something called a Red Book at the Department of Agriculture. How does that play a role in keeping track of things?
I can't say I'm too familiar with that one. It'd probably be a good question for my counterpart, Russell Redding. I'm sure he could get into that in more details than I could.
So let's talk a little bit about the Game Commission. How is it organized?
Yeah, the Game Commission is created by statute, Title 34, and it's the Game and Wildlife Code. It creates the commission and establishes 9 commissioners who are responsible for regulations. They are responsible for establishing the hunting and trapping seasons. They set the policy for the Game Commission. Underneath that is our staff, and we have about 800 employees who implement the regulations that are passed by our Board of Commissioners. So our 9 commissioners appointed by the governor, confirmed by the Senate, and then staff that implements those regulations.
How long have you been with the commission?
I've been with the commission almost 18 years now. I've served in various roles, first as legislative liaison, working directly with the General Assembly to pass statutes amending the Game and Wildlife Code, also to make them aware of our program areas, and then served as the director of the Bureau of Information and Education, and now the executive director.
What drew you to this field?
As a lifelong hunter, it was a natural fit for me. I've always had an interest in wildlife, had an interest in hunting, trapping, and when the opportunity came to work for the Game Commission, I absolutely jumped at it.
What sources of revenue does the Game Commission draw on?
Game Commission's primary source of revenue is our hunting and trapping license fees. So as hunters purchase a license, those fees come back to the Game Commission. They don't go to any other department, to the General Tax Fund. They come to the Game Commission, similar to how fishing licenses are collected for the Fish and Boat Commission. Also, though, the Game Commission's main revenue source is natural resource development that takes place on game lands, particularly in recent years, the Marcellus Shale. Game Commission has had holdings where Marcellus Shale development on game lands has taken place, and that revenue then comes back to the Commission. And I think the third one I would mention is federal funds. The Pittman-Robertson Act, which creates an excise tax on the sale of equipment relating to hunting, trapping. A portion of those proceeds then are sent to the Game Commission.
Let's talk a little bit about the shale drilling.
Yeah.
How extensive is that on Commission lands?
It's pretty extensive. We manage about 1.5 million acres of game lands. So we've allowed the use of drilling to take place on those game lands, and then that revenue comes back to the Commission.
So as you calculate your funds for the year, how do you balance them out between these different sources?
As far as the revenue coming in?
Sure.
In recent years, natural resource development has been the main revenue source. About 90 million that has come in through natural resource development, and that fluctuates a lot. In past couple years, most recently, I say 90, that's what it's been about this year, what's what we're anticipating for the next year. But previously to that, in about 2022, 2023, that revenue really increased, and a lot of that was, or the big source was, the price of natural gas went up significantly due to geopolitical factors. You had war in Europe, caused all kind of uncertainty, and the price of natural gas increased dramatically. When that happened, the Commission experienced a significant revenue boost because of that. So we experienced over $200 million in natural gas revenue during that brief window, during that time period. We don't anticipate that is anything that's going to happen anytime soon. It could, of course, but we're not budgeting as if it will. We expect that amount will decrease down to around more sustainable long-term level, around 90 million. So that's, for us, that's a significant part of our budget. That's about half of the revenues that are coming in. That has allowed us to make some significant improvements, some investments. It's allowed us to purchase some game lands, to improve the infrastructure on those game lands. And really what we're doing is using that money and investing it back into wildlife and into our hunters and trappers.
How does the Commission monitor and oversee drilling on game lands?
We work very well with those companies that are involved in that process. We have staff that are active in ensuring that they're following the regulations that we put in place, the procedures that we put in place. Fortunately, a lot of the drilling that takes place, there's the ability to come from different areas and go underneath the ground at great distances, so we're not seeing a lot of surface impacts. That way we can make sure that while we can still generate some revenue from the drilling, we're not losing large parts of lands to our hunters and trappers as well as to wildlife.
So how should hunters approach these sites? If they're out hunting, should they stay away from them? What should they do?
Yeah, and they're readily apparent. The hunters know where they are. It's pretty obvious where they are. And yeah, absolutely, we would encourage them to stay away.
I want to go back to the Game Commission itself. How does the commission make decisions?
As far as our Board of Commissioners, our board meets 4 times a year. In fact, we have a meeting coming up in January, or we just had a meeting in January. We have a meeting coming up in April. The primary purpose of those meetings, the first 2 of the year, in January as well as in April, is to set the seasons and bag limits for the upcoming year. So our board reviews the data provided to it by our staff, as well as takes input in from the hunting population and makes the decisions that then set the seasons for the upcoming year. So that takes place, again, that process starts in January, goes until April. So next month our board's going to meet again. And that allows us to put those regulations in place and make our hunters aware for the upcoming season.
What are some of the key issues that you expect to address in the next meeting?
The April meeting is going to be a very important one because it's when we finalize those seasons and bag limits. That means setting the dates for upcoming hunting seasons. In particular, as you're probably well aware, the opening day of firearm season draws a lot of attention from our hunters. They want to see when that date is going to be. In recent years, there's been a debate as to whether it should be on a Saturday or it should be on a Monday following Thanksgiving. That is probably the one that draws the most attention from our hunters, but certainly a lot more gets accomplished during that meeting. You know, these dates are in place for all species that we have hunting seasons for, but the deer start seems to be the one that draws the most attention.
Why is that the one that's so popular?
Rifle season for deer is essentially the Super Bowl for hunting in Pennsylvania. It is the one that seems to generate the most interest. It's the one where there's the most participation as well. We know that our hunters are out there. Several 100,000 hunters will be out there on that date for going for deer. So the board has, over the past couple of years, set that season on a Saturday following Thanksgiving. Back in January when they met, they gave preliminary approval to keeping it on that Saturday. But when they come back in April, there'll be another chance to vote on it.
What are some of the advantages of having it opening day on a Saturday?
The primary advantage really is it just gets more people out in the woods. And that's what the board's focus has been all along with this, is to have more hunters out there. Hunting has been going through a long, gradual period of decline, not just in Pennsylvania, but nationwide. Hunting participation really peaked in the early 1980s and has been declining ever since then. What the board's goal is to do is to reverse that trend to the extent possible and bring hunters back into the fold, as well as reach out to new and young potential hunters and make them become active hunters as well. It's kind of a decision that the board has done where you want to look at how we can increase participation in the short term, but just as, if not more importantly, is how can we do so long term? How can we get that next generation of hunters involved? And that's been the focal point for what the board's concern has been, and they see the Saturday opener as a way that we can increase the participation and get those younger hunters.
You mentioned that it peaked in the 1980s. Talk a little bit more about some of those patterns over time. When did it really start to kick off, and what would lead to the decline?
Yeah, hunting experienced really a boom in popularity following World War II. You had tens of thousands of veterans returning to Pennsylvania who had, as you would imagine, experienced a great deal of in-depth training on using of firearms, but also just a spirit of camaraderie. And from that came a boom of hunting, particularly in the north central part of the state, where deer populations were their highest at the time. So you had really a culture was created in those areas where hunters were flocking to them in that late November, early December time period when firearms deer season started. There was a camp culture that was created, and really an explosion of hunting was taking place. Also around that time, you had the baby boomer generation being born. So you had, again, those returning veterans from World War II who were then taking younger hunters out, all of which just really led to an explosion of popularity of hunting in Pennsylvania, but nationwide as well, that peaked in that early 1980s timeframe. Since then, as I said, hunting participation has been kind of on a long, slow decline. We are very fortunate in Pennsylvania that it hasn't declined nearly as fast as it has in some other areas, which is a testament to the strength of our hunting culture in Pennsylvania. But nonetheless, we are not immune from that decline that has been taking place, and that's what the issue that our board was determined to address. That's why they have changed the season structure to try to get, again, those new younger hunters involved and keep them involved in the sport.
Are there training programs for people who are interested in taking up the sport?
Absolutely. Under the law, in order to participate in hunting, first an individual has to take a hunter trapper education class. So that's just the threshold, is you have to take that class in order to be eligible. And we'll put through about 25,000 Pennsylvanians this year. Traditionally, every year we put through about that number. But beyond that, even for those who are new to the sport, have an interest in the sport, and have taken that class, we offer what we call a Learn to Hunt program. This is for individuals, again, who might not have somebody who has mentored them, can show them the different areas of hunting, the opportunities that are out there for different species. So we have them the opportunity to go through a Learn to Hunt program. And then from there, the best way, honestly, is to have somebody else. And we certainly encourage those who are familiar, experienced with hunters to mentor somebody else, a new hunter, and get them involved.
Is there a firearms training requirement as part of this training process?
There is not. Certainly not on a hands-on, I should say, but there, as part of that hunter-trapper education curriculum, there is a great deal of time spent on how to use a firearm, the best practices for safety involving a firearm. All the key points that, if you look at the data that we have as far as incidents involving hunting-related shooting incidents, it's usually because those key points of firearm safety, there was a breakdown there. So we really encourage our hunters, if we could stay with those basic elements of firearm safety, treating every firearm like it's loaded, pointing every firearm in a safe direction, and keeping the finger away from the trigger until it's time to fire, as well as knowing what's beyond your target. That would eliminate the vast majority of our, if not all of our hunting-related shooting incidents.
So the Game Commission owns and manages many lands around the Commonwealth. Are they evenly distributed, or they tend to be more in some areas rather than others?
They are not nearly as evenly distributed as we would like. They are... good bit of our land holdings are in the north central and the northwest, and there's a lot of reasons historically for why that is the case, including probably the primary one is the limitation on how much the Game Commission can spend per acre in acquiring lands. Where we would like to see moving forward is the ability to purchase more lands in areas where we have our high hunter population, in areas like the southeast, in areas like the southwest. And I'm really happy to see over the past year we were able, and we're finalizing deals to purchase land in Allegheny County, as well as a big tract of land in Dauphin County. So those are two instances in which we've been able to strategically to acquire land closer to where our hunters are, closer to the higher population areas. So to answer your question, no, not evenly distributed, more so a lot of groupings in the north central, northwest, for a whole lot of reasons. But as we look to the future, we'd love to see that legislation change to allow us to purchase more lands closer to where our hunters are and where high population areas are.
Talk about that, the legal process. What are some of the boundaries that, how much land can the commission buy? What's that process like?
Yeah, the Game Commission, again, is set by statute, Title 34 of the Game and Wildlife Code, and there's a chapter that speaks to what the Game Commission's abilities are as it relates to the purchase of real estate. One of the, probably the primary hindrance or obstacles that's in place under the law is, in the majority of situations, the Game Commission is limited to paying $400 per acre. Now, there's a few exceptions underneath that, as you would expect. One of which relates specifically to counties of the second class, so that's how we're able to buy that land in Allegheny County. Another is there's an exception when you're buying lands for right-of-way for access points, which is how we're also able to buy the land in Dauphin County. But that process requires us then to have to essentially pass on parcels in some areas because of that 400-acre requirement. That's been in place for several decades now, so we would love to either see that lifted or adjusted, or just to give us a little bit more flexibility to buy some land in some of those areas where we think there'd be a higher value from doing so.
So are these properties where the property owner just decides they want to offer it to the commission, or does the commission seek it out?
Yes, it's a little of both. A lot of times, property owners do approach us. In fact, we have to turn down the vast majority of potential acquisitions where an individual comes to us because they want to see us manage and own that land. So we turn down a lot of parcels just because either we can't get there with the statutory limits that we have to work through, or because it's not a strategic investment that we would want to make at that time. It has to essentially check a lot of boxes for us as far as our ability to manage it, ability for hunters to participate or access that property, as far as the habitats for wildlife. There's a criteria that we go through to make sure that this potential acquisition is one that is something that would be to the benefit of us, to wildlife, to our constituents. So yes, individuals approach us all the time, but also sometimes we will seek them out and look for potential acquisitions. And a lot of times where that is if we own a parcel of land and there's an inholding where it's privately held inside the interior or adjacent to it, and there's an opportunity where that parcel comes up for sale. Those are ones that we really move quickly on because it'll allow us to unify the ownership of that parcel.
Do you work with local communities to determine if they're okay with land being part of the commission?
We don't technically, as of now, have a formal process for what that looks like, but it is one that we've been more engaged with recently than ever before, because we do understand, and to your earlier question about where our land is, with a lot of it being in that north central, northwest part of the state, we do understand some of those communities quite frankly, have concerns as to seeing additional parcels being owned by the commission. So we've, over the past year or so, we've done more outreach with those communities, as well as, in particular, their state representatives or their state senators who represent those communities and can voice those concerns with us. So I'd say that's an ongoing process. It's one that we continue to do and develop to make sure that we're refining it and getting it done correctly. But yes, we are cognizant of the needs and respecting the concerns of stakeholders, and that includes hunters, trappers, outdoor recreationists, but as well as landowners in those communities where there's land that we're looking at acquiring.
So the Game Commission owned land, state parks, state forests, are there legal distinctions between how those types of lands have to be managed?
Definitely different missions between the two agencies. Primarily, when you talk about state parks and state forests, you're talking about Department of Conservation and Natural Resources. Their mission is much more, I'd say, recreation focused, with a broader recreation focus than the Game Commission. Our responsibilities and our primary mission when it comes to owning real estate is how can we create healthy habitat for wildlife so that wildlife populations can thrive on that habitat. But then also, how can we create recreational opportunities for our hunters and trappers? Those are the primary mission of game lands owned by the Game Commission. Then to the extent that we have secondary uses, other outdoor forms of recreation, they can take place on game lands, but they must do so in a manner that doesn't interfere with the primary purpose of those lands, being habitat for wildlife as well as hunting and trapping opportunities.
Well, let's give our guest a break for a minute while we look at programming notes for PCN. Live budget hearings before the House Appropriations Committee continues tomorrow. We're live with the Insurance Department at 10 a.m., followed by the State Treasury at 1 p.m. To find all budget hearings and PCN exclusive interviews, go to PCN Select. On Wednesday, join us for a double dose of On the Issues. Representative Nate Davidson joins us to talk about his bill that would give survivors of child sexual abuse more time to file lawsuits. Watch Wednesday night at 7. Then John Eckenrode, president of the PA State Corrections Officers Association, talks about the governor's plan to close 2 state correctional facilities. That's Wednesday night at 7:30. This week on Journalist Roundtable, we're joined by Harrison Cann, senior reporter from City of State, Pennsylvania, Julia Taruso, politics and governing reporter with the Philadelphia Inquirer, and Mark Levy, State House and politics reporter for the Associated Press. Journalist Roundtable airs Thursday night at 7. The public affairs coverage you watch on PCN TV is now free online. Go to PCNTV.com and check out our streaming service, PCN Select. PCN is Everything Pennsylvania. We're a 501c3 nonprofit television network that relies on viewers like you. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. Now, one of the programs that the Commission operates is Hunters Sharing the Harvest. Tell us about that program.
So that's a program that we partner with. That's an entity that we've been a big supporter of over the years. It's a great program, and we are happy to be a supporting partner with them. What that program does is it allows hunters who harvest a deer to drop that deer off at a processor that's participating in the program. And then that processor will work with the Hunters Sharing the Harvest to get that deer meat to food insecure families throughout the Commonwealth. It's a point, I think, of pride for Pennsylvania hunters, or it should be, that we were the #1 state when it came to donating venison last year with over 2 million pounds. So we've been very proud partner of Hunters Sharing the Harvest for decades now. And it's a program that is really continuing to grow and that we want to see grow across the state. It's really a way for hunters, individuals like myself, who our primary purpose is to hunt deer for food, and maybe we've gotten enough. We feel like our freezer's full. We're good for the year. Nonetheless, we recognize at the Game Commission that sometimes it requires killing additional deer to meet our management objectives. What we'd like to see is hunters still engaged, go out, maybe kill an additional deer, but then donate that venison so that it's going to families in need. So that way it's really checking a couple boxes. It's helping us continue to manage the deer population through the removal of additional deer, but then it's also giving back to the communities in a really great, healthy way.
How is the processing funded?
Through Hunters Sharing the Harvest. They work with supporters like the Game Commission, and I know that they've been very active in recent years in working in reaching out to members of the agricultural community to bring them in and have them engaged in this process as well. But the Game Commission is their primary supporter.
And if people want to get involved in this, what can they do? Where do they get information?
They have a great website. Randy Ferguson is their CEO. He's very active in the community. I know they had a booth at the outdoor show. I stopped by several times, and he was engaging hunters. So yeah, they have made a real effort to get out there and increase awareness of this program, but then as well to increase funding, because the processor fee is then absorbed by their program, so that requires funding. And again, that's why the Game Commission has been such a big supporter and proud to do so.
You mentioned managing the deer population. How does that process work? How do you assess how many numbers are appropriate for a certain area and what you need to do about it? Sure.
So there's a three-pronged approach when it comes to managing deer. What we look at is first, is the herd healthy? So there's a herd health matrix. And this is where things like chronic wasting disease really comes into play. So we look at, is the herd healthy? This is also evaluated when we do our data collection each year and look at deer that are harvested. We measure the herd health, what we call. The second part of it is we look at what impacts the deer are having to the forested landscape. And we are checking there for regeneration of plots. Deer are prolific eaters. So if the population reaches a certain point, we will notice that the forest is not regenerating because of it. Deer will be essentially browsing and eating on those young trees as they're coming through. So we look at herd health, we look at forest health. And then the third thing that we look at is deer-human conflicts. We want to get a sense of what does the population feel, our human population, what level do they feel like the deer population is at? Is it too high? Is it too low? Is it just right? And we bring in those three areas, those three factors when it comes to managing deer. So we look at, again, human deer conflicts, herd health, and habitat health. From that, we determine if the population should be stable, if it should be allowed to increase, or if the population should decrease. And then the primary way that we go about reaching that management objective is through the issuance of antlerless licenses. That's the best way to control the deer population. So in areas where the population seems to be stable, we'll keep those licenses consistent year to year. Where the deer population needs to be increased, then we will reduce the number of antlerless licenses available. And in areas where the reverse is true, then we'll just add more antlerless licenses to the allocation that hunters can buy.
Is the commission involved in managing deer populations in suburban and urban areas?
It's certainly a factor that comes into play, particularly when we talk about human deer conflicts. It's those suburban areas where those conflicts are most acute. Our role is working with those communities, and one thing that we'd like to see more of an emphasis done in moving forward in the future is to allow hunting in some of those areas. Obviously, that's difficult, complicated, particularly in areas where there's high human density, not a lot of public land, if any at all. But we are required under law, and we firmly believe that the best method for controlling deer populations is through our hunting. So one thing that we're looking at in particular right now with agricultural communities, but we believe there's a potential to expand it to suburban areas as well, is to create essentially an enhanced hunter-trapper education course for hunters who've shown the ability to safely and effectively remove deer, where we can then provide even advanced training to them with the hope that we can work with some of those suburban communities where they do have deer problems, where we can then match them up with highly trained hunters to go into those areas and remove deer, because that's, again, the best way of reducing deer problems is through removing deer, particularly antlerless deer.
Are there other animals that the commission manages the same way they do the deer population?
We try to manage all wildlife through that kind of scientific process where we evaluate the populations, we see what kind of impact that it's having, and then make adjustments to our seasons or to the tags accordingly. And I think probably one of the best examples of that in recent years would be our black bear population. Going back about 5-6 years ago, the black bear population seemed to be at a high level, and as a result of it being at that high level, there was a good number of complaints regarding bear-human interactions, particularly in agricultural areas where a hungry bear heading into the fall can do a lot of damage to corn crops. And farmers in our north central areas were complaining about bear impacts. As a result, what our board did, upon recommendations from the staff, is they increased the length of that bear season. And they had to come in at an earlier period than it had before, which allowed for more bears to be harvested by our hunters. And as a result, the conflicts between farmers in those communities seemed to decrease. So I think that one thing I would stress is that wildlife populations there's always an ebb and flow with them. There's not this perfect number where they kind of exist in perpetuity. More so, it's a pendulum. There's an ebb and flow. Populations are high, which cause problems in some areas, particularly for our big game species, be it deer, bear. And then we'll respond, and the population then will respond accordingly to the increase in hunting pressure. And it's something that demonstrates the need for that constant monitoring, the constant data collection that our staff do.
Well, we've talked a lot about hunting, but let's talk about trapping. Take us into the field. What does trapping look like?
Yeah, trapping is something that has a long pastime and history in Pennsylvania. I mentioned how hunting had that boom in the 1980s. Trapping was probably a little before then, when fur prices were high. That's what really drove a resurgence in trapping decades ago, when individuals who trapped fox, even skunk, raccoon, those pelts they could then sell for profit, which generated a real interest in trapping in the 50s, 60s, 70s time period. Since the fur market isn't nearly as high as it was at that time period, in fact, some of the prices for pelts today are the same they were decades ago. It's now more so done for just recreational purposes. Those who really enjoy being out there in the woods during the winter period still are heavily engaged in trapping, and that's, again, something that there's a long history, a long pastime of in Pennsylvania.
One of the other diseases that is often found in the wild is chronic wasting disease. What is that? What types of animals are affected by it?
Chronic wasting disease has the ability to impact deer and elk. Fortunately, in Pennsylvania, it hasn't been found in our elk population, but it is something that we are very cognizant of and aware of, and invest a lot of time and resources in surveilling the impact to our deer populations in Pennsylvania.
What types of efforts are being made to address it?
So ever since chronic wasting was found over a decade ago, we've identified those areas where it is and engage in heavy surveillance, as well as we ask for increased hunter participation to remove deer from those areas. We talked earlier about high-path avian influenza and how it's spread through the grouping of those animals. Chronic wasting disease is the same way. It's an infectious disease. So the best known way of reducing the spread of that disease is to reduce the population levels. So where chronic wasting disease has been found, we increase our surveillance, but also we call for increased harvest in those areas to lower those deer populations so that we're lowering the spread of the disease.
So if a hunter takes an animal that they suspect has chronic wasting disease, what should they do?
In those areas where we've identified chronic wasting disease, we make it available for hunters to have their deer sampled. So we have collection bins throughout those areas, and we really encourage hunters, particularly in those areas where we know chronic wasting disease is prevalent in the wild herd. If you shoot a deer in that area, we really recommend that you get that deer tested. So there are collection bins throughout the areas. Certainly go to our website, look for the map of where they are, but we've strategically placed them so that they are close by for hunters in those areas. And we really recommend that before you consume that venison, that you wait to see the results of that test.
Are there precautions that people should take when handling those types of animals?
Just typical precautions. We always recommend, again, be it high-path avian influenza or be it for deer, we recommend hunters wear gloves at the time. Certainly recommend not to consume an animal that when you killed it appeared sick. Out of precaution, contact the Game Commission. That extends to chronic wasting disease as well, or high-path AI, any of those instances where an animal is noticeably sick. We would not recommend that animal be consumed until there's testing done. But that being said, we also recognize that when it comes to chronic wasting disease, again, the best way to slow the spread is through hunters harvesting additional deer. So I want our hunters to know that they can do so in a way where they can feel comfortable, that they can get that animal tested. And for instances in which the test comes back positive, they can get a replacement tag to help hopefully then harvest an additional deer. We really want to encourage hunters in those areas to do their part and increase the harvest of deer.
Is chronic wasting disease something that's been in Pennsylvania for a long time?
I believe over a decade now. I want to say 2012 is when it was first detected, maybe a little after that. But yeah, it's been in Pennsylvania for roughly a decade. Started in the south central part of the state, I want to say Adams County. Then it was found again throughout, and particularly there's the Bedford, Fulton County areas seems to be where it's most prevalent.
Now, when you're out talking with farmers about their experiences with hunters, what do they tell you? Hunters and farmers have a great relationship. It's a long history of that, and it's both sides are dependent upon each other. I grew up hunting, and some of the first places that I went was onto my neighbor's farm. He had a problem with groundhogs in particular on his property. So he absolutely encouraged us to be out there, and it demonstrated that connection that hunters have with farmers, where farmers who have wildlife population problems on their farms need hunters, and hunters, conversely, need places where they can hunt. So it's a relationship that, when it's working, is a great relationship where both sides are getting something that they value from each other. When I've talked to farmers, though, and landowners, some of the biggest concerns they have as far as letting more people onto their property is they would just like to see some comfort level with that person who's knocking on their door, asking to come hunt, which is, again, I referenced a program that we're getting ready to roll out where we can potentially bridge that gap and allow hunters who have an interest in hunting some of these areas, these places, be it farms or be it in some suburban areas,
to go through an enhanced safety program. The goal being that will give that farmer who sees a hunter knocking on their door, that will give them potentially an extra comfort level, so that they will let that person onto their property. Because when that relationship is working, when hunters are getting access to private property to hunt, it allows us to manage wildlife on those areas, and then at the same time it helps reduce the conflicts.
So is this program the Master Hunter Certification Program? What's involved in that? How do people get involved?
Well, it's very early. Just moving forward from the conceptual stage to getting ready to implement it. We're looking at areas across the state where there seems to be the highest problem areas, and identifying them. It looks like in the Southwest is where we're hearing from a lot of farmers, as well as areas of the Northeast. So we'll probably do a pilot over the next couple of months where we'll roll it out in those areas, target it there, where what we want is get input from landowners as far as what kind of enhanced training would they like to see, what would give them the comfort level to allow somebody onto their property, and then we'll provide that curriculum to our hunters so that they can go through this course, get the training that they need, and then we'll be engaged in matching up landowners with hunters. So very early stages of this program. It's a new program, but it's one where we see a ton of potential. And in my travelings and talking to farmers, I think they're pretty excited about it as well.
Do other states have similar programs?
I'm only aware of a handful of states that do. Delaware and Montana come to mind. So we'll certainly take a look at what's been effective in those states, but I think we also recognize the need to tailor it specifically to Pennsylvania and the needs of Pennsylvania farmers, as well as the needs of Pennsylvania hunters.
How does the Game Commission manage the number of pheasants that are available and the population?
Yeah, pheasants. Unfortunately, there's not a wild pheasant population in the state, but nonetheless, that pheasant hunting tradition and pastime is something that's big in Pennsylvania. Hundreds of thousands of hunters chased pheasants over the years, and for a lot of new hunters, that was the gateway to get them engaged into hunting. We see that with pheasants, and we see that with small game in general, where those kind of, again, it's almost a gateway to pursuing other species. So because of that, because of how important pheasant hunting is in Pennsylvania, we have a pheasant propagation program where we purchase pheasants that are several days old. We will grow them throughout the year, and then we release them in the fall. This past year, we released well over 200,000 birds. I believe it was 225,000 birds on counties or in game lands all across the state. And one thing that was even special for this past hunting season is we had what we called some leftover birds. So we were able to release them later on than ever before in the January, February time period. So given the popularity of our pheasant program and pheasant hunting in general, it's something that we're glad that we can do and support the continuation of pheasant hunting in Pennsylvania.
How does the Commission manage out-of-state residents getting hunting licenses for Pennsylvania?
Yeah, that's something that is provided for in law, where non-residents can certainly hunt in Pennsylvania. They have an additional fee, and again, that's set by law as well. That's not something the Game Commission has the ability to set. For our resident hunters, it's a $20 hunting license. For non-resident, it's $100. But even at $100, it's an incredible bargain. Most non-residents would tell you that $100 is more affordable than what they pay in their state. Hunting, given the pastime in Pennsylvania, we know that a lot of non-residents who maybe grew up in Pennsylvania, maybe still have family in Pennsylvania or a hunting camp in Pennsylvania, come back to Pennsylvania to hunt, and we certainly encourage that.
What's the state of the elk population in Pennsylvania?
The elk population is strong, it's pretty robust, and it is something that has garners a lot of attention throughout the year. We do a pretty active surveillance program of our elk to check on all those things about health, make sure that they're free from chronic wasting disease. Every elk that's harvested gets tested for chronic wasting disease. And it's something that is very popular, brings in a lot of tourists into those communities. A lot of people are excited to see elk, but still a lot of people don't realize yet that we have elk in Pennsylvania. It seems like every week I encounter somebody who is surprised to find out that we absolutely have a thriving elk population in that north central part of the state, and it's something where We've allowed the use of regulated hunting to keep that population in check, keep it within the confines of the area where there's good habitat, where there's low human conflicts. And again, it's thriving, and a lot of Pennsylvanians love nothing more than to go up there around that September time period when the elk mating season is taking place, and that's when they're very active, very vocal, and it's amazing to watch.
Were elks, do they have a continuous presence in Pennsylvania, or were they reintroduced?
They were reintroduced over 100 years ago. That population, the Pennsylvania native population, was eliminated in late 1800s. However, elk were actually transported back to Pennsylvania from Yellowstone, and were able to continue to thrive and grow in Pennsylvania, due largely to the intensive habitat efforts that took place by the Game Commission. That's a lot of it took place on a game lands right there in Elk County, where intensive habitat efforts, converting a lot of reclaimed mines to grow the native grasses that elk thrive off of, and that population has responded accordingly. And some of the biggest bulls really in North America are right there in Pennsylvania.
Stephen Smith is the Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Game Commission. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
PCN's Ellen France spoke with Representative Jason Dawkins about his legislation on unemployment benefits for domestic abuse survivors.
Welcome to our program. You've proposed an amendment to the unemployment compensation law. What does this law say currently?
Hey, how are you? This is Representative Dawkins, and this particular legislation really helps protect survivors of domestic violence by allowing them to receive unemployment compensation, which is UC benefits, if they quit their job because they are because of their continued employment would be jeopardize their safety or the safety of a member of their family or household.
What would this amendment process look like for this law?
So currently right now, how it works, we don't have anything that's clear in terms of statute of how we would actually deal with these particular cases. So this particular amendment, or in this case, this bill, because we ran this bill last session under the previous co-chair, Ryan McKenzie, who is now in the U.S. Congress. So we picked up this legislation because we thought this legislation definitely needed to, improves and streamlines the current UC applicant process for domestic violence for survivors, and expedites the Department of Labor and Industry to review these claims. So we wanted to make sure that we were moving quickly on this particular legislation, because we know there's a ton of folks currently in our workforce who are dealing with this issue currently.
How can a domestic violence situation cause somebody to potentially have to quit their job?
Well, several reasons. We all know there's a lot of love interest that may occur at the workplace, and or advancements that may not be warranted. We know when you work in close proximity with other people, there's always a chance that someone may abuse that relationship, or this may encroach in the personal space. And when it's been, brought up to, the supervisor or your managing directors, or whoever may be in charge of supervisor, if that then goes on, continue without any type of discipline actions for the individual who's making the claim, then we want to make sure that we provide a safe haven for those folks to say, you know what, this particular company is not taking his claim seriously enough. I would like to remove myself from this environment, but I do not want to remove myself without the possibility of still being able to maintain my bills until I can find additional employment.
How can victims of domestic violence in the workplace claim these unemployment benefits?
The same way you claim any other UC benefits, you'll make the claim, you'll file directly with the department, and once those claims are filed, then you'll go through the same process that other claimants go through to receive UC benefits.
Do any other states have something like this in place?
So we've been looking at a few other places that looked at this particular legislation. So we want to make sure that we're doing this here in the state of Pennsylvania, because we did not have anything that would be modeled exactly the way that we're looking to model this particular legislation. So we want to kind of be one of the leading states that can do this correctly.
You mentioned picking up this bill from a previous legislator. Where is this bill in the legislative process currently?
So currently right now, we have this bill in the committee in which I chair, which is the Labor and Industry Committee. We will be advancing this bill to the full floor, and then hopefully we can get it over to the Senate and have it passed. We'll love to get it passed before the budget. So fingers crossed, that's what we're going to be working towards.
Representative Jason Dawkins, thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me.
That concludes today's show. Join us on Wednesday for a double dose of On the Issues. Representative Nate Davidson joins us to talk about his bill that would give survivors of child sexual abuse more time to file lawsuits. That's Wednesday night at 7. Then John Eckenrode, president of the Pennsylvania Corrections Officers Association, talks about the governor's plan to close 2 state correctional facilities. That's Wednesday at 7:30 p.m. And I'm Phil Beckman. Thanks for watching.